Good morning, everyone. We're starting a little early, just letting folks file in for a second. So we'll be going live in about 2 minutes. All righty, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and begin. But before we begin, I'm going to go over a few things. First, hello, everyone, and welcome to Nawadam Logistics webinar on navigating the 2025 tariff landscape, key updates on impacts on U.S. trade. We're thrilled to have you all join us here today as we break down the latest tariff developments and what they mean for your supply chain. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. This session is being recorded and a copy will be distributed to all registrants after the event. So if you need to step away, don't worry, you won't miss a thing. Also, to ensure a smooth experience, all attendees' cameras and microphones are automatically turned off. However, we do encourage you to engage with us through the Q&A function. We have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to submit your questions at any time. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive in, and I will go ahead and hand it on over to Christine Smith.
Thank you, Seth. Good morning. I'm Christine Smith, the VP of Compliance and Process for Nawadam. Thank you for joining the call this morning. Today, we'll be taking a look at the recent news. We're going to take a look back and review some of that pre-inauguration potential tariff talk. We'll look at current tariff landscape, potential impacts and considerations, as well as customs bonds. So if we look at the most recent news, we're seeing a bit of a shift from the talk of a flat fee for all imports into the U.S., and we're seeing that shift over to reciprocal tariffs. As of Sunday, we were told again that there would be reciprocal tariffs, that the newly imposed tariffs would mostly be reciprocal, with the U.S. applying the same tariff that other countries impose on the U.S. So we're expecting an announcement or an announced plan that was to come out yesterday or today, so we're still pending. The duties are stated to be almost effective almost immediately, and also impact every country. So again, this is kind of very new to us. We have not seen the plan for the reciprocal tariffs. As soon as we get that plan and we fact checked it, we will do a trade alert. In other news this week, on February 10th, 2025, Section 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel imports and specified derivative products were amended to impose a flat 25% tariffs. So the new tariffs are effective as of March 12th. This amendment is going to remove existing exclusions and country-specific agreements also on March 12th. An expanded list of derivative products remains pending. The effective dates for the expanded list of derivative products taking that tariff is pending, and that's pending the Secretary of Commerce notifying that inadequate systems in place for processing and collecting of the tariffs. We're also still pending the Federal Register publication, which we expect will have further details along with an updated annex. So for steel, any derivative steel article identified in Annex 1 that's not in Chapter 73 of the HTS, the duty shall apply only to the steel content of the derivative steel article. So the Secretary shall publish a notice in the Federal Register to this effect, including Annex 1, to the proclamation. So for steel products originating from Turkey, a 50% tariff will apply. Aluminum, for any derivative aluminum product covered in Annex, not classified under Chapter 76, that additional 25% will apply only to the aluminum content of the derivative. If the primary aluminum is of Russia origin, a 20% tariff will apply. So on this slide, we've also included the link to the White House fact sheet, as well as the White House article adjusting imports of steel into the United States. In other news, de minimis. So de minimis is those low value shipments, less than $800 per day per person, mostly impactful with e-commerce. So de minimis, as of February 1st, the executive order had stated that the article subject to the additional 10% under 9903.0120 tariff code would not be eligible for de minimis filing for China. So basically, it took out that eligibility for that duty-free exemption for Chinese products. Then on February 7th, the executive order was amended. And so that amendment basically reinstated the eligibility for de minimis filing for China goods. However, I would call out that that executive order amendment says that the duty-free exemption under de minimis shall cease to be available for articles upon notification of the Secretary of Commerce to the President that adequate systems are in place to fully and expediently process and collect tariff revenue applicable pursuant to basically de minimis. So again, it was reinstated. China can now again resume filing de minimis entries to get exempted from duties. So the latest on de minimis came out yesterday. We had a draft update of the Federal Register notice, which is to be published today, in a custom CMS message 64082249. And those notices basically were stating that for the time period where de minimis was not eligible and duties were paid, that customs will not issue refunds. So the executive order amendment is not retroactive. So if you filed entries and paid duties between the 4th and the 7th, while it was unavailable, you will not be able to recoup those duties. The Federal Register notice is, there's a link to the Federal Register notice at the bottom if you'd like to read further. So if we take a look back at what we were talking about pre-inauguration, I left this slide in for many reasons. One is we really thought the president would use the International Emergency Economic Powers, or IEPA, to leverage new tariffs, which is exactly what he did when we start looking at Canada, Mexico, and China. We talked about the reciprocal tariffs. So initially, we were told that we would expect a 10 to 20% tariff, flat tariff on all imports into the U.S. However, now we're waiting on that reciprocal tariff plan. I again want to call out that these are the trade acts that allows the president to impact or change or amend the tariffs. So he has the authority to do so, already granted in the trade acts. If we look at, for example, Section 338, which allows up to 50% on value, similar action on third-party countries, we're trying to keep an eye on what those third countries may be. So if you're looking at resourcing goods right now in order to save tariffs, that we make the best decisions possible. So one of the things we're seeing in the news is they're referring to a lot of tariff whiplash. I personally have been on a lot of calls over the last week where it's, wait, what? So we were seeing a lot of changes. It's a very fluid situation. So we're monitoring closely and sending out trade alerts after we do fact checks. So if we look, most of the tariffs we were talking day one implementation, which was inauguration day on January 20th. And then those were pushed to 2/1. A lot of us were questioning the 2/1 because it did fall on a Saturday. So then we were told that the start date would be 2/4, which is February 4th. The tariffs that were to be applicable were going to be under IEPA. But if we break it down as to where we are today, for Mexico, there was a 25 tariff increase under IEPA in the order, but we are under a 30-day pause until March 4th, 2025. That is in part because President Trump and President Sheinbaum in Mexico reached an agreement in which Mexico has agreed to immediately send the 10,000 soldiers to the United States-Mexico border to prevent the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration into the U.S. So with Canada, we see a very similar thing happen. We see that the 25% increase was under IEPA. However, we are under a 30-day pause until March 4th. A lot of us are kind of wondering if that March 4th date will push out. If you remember under America's first policy, that basically studies are due to the president on April 1st. So we do not know if they'll have some push out until those studies are completed or if we'll stand with March 4th. But today it's that 30-day pause until March 4th. So for Canada, we did see that pause in part because the Prime Minister is implementing a $1.3 billion border plan. Along with that, he'll launch a U.S.-Canada's Joint Strike Force to combat fentanyl, money laundering, and organized crime. Canada will also name a fentanyl Cesar and list Mexican cartels as terrorist groups. De minimis. De minimis, we talked about that a bit earlier in all the changes, but the initial order stated that de minimis would not be available for China and Hong Kong as of 2/4. However, it has been reinstated until such time that they are ready to process the collections of the tariffs. China and Hong Kong, that is the one tariff we have in place today. It did start as a 2/4. It was under IEPA, and it is a 10% tariff increase. So China and Hong Kong, new HTS codes were developed in order to allow the application of the tariffs. We talked about the new 10% tariff under IEPA effective from February 4th at 12:01 a.m. Customs published guidance under the CSMS message. We put a link to it. We've also included a link to the Federal Register notice. In reaction, China's Ministry of Finance announced they would apply 10% tax on crude oil, agriculture machinery, large displacement cards, pickup trucks. They'll also apply a 15% tax on certain types of coal and liquefied natural gas. These tariffs were imposed on February 10th. So also, China has brought a dispute to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So we'll see where that ends up, and we'll put messages out as we get the information. So the new tariff numbers that were available to us for the new duties and any exemptions, the first one is ending, it's 9903.01.20. So 0.20 is that 10% overall tariff, and that's how we're applying it. I've had a lot of questions this week on, is this an overall tariff? And the answer is yes, for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but we don't have those product code lists that people are looking at the list of tariff numbers and looking for those exemptions. In general, it is an overall tariff. So we do have an exemption under 0.23, which is a goods in transit exemption. We'll discuss that on the next slide. But you have to meet the specified requirements in order to get that exemption, and it is limited to a period of time. 0.21 for personal use included in accompanied baggages of people arriving into the U.S., you would be exempted. 0.22 if you fall under 50 U.S.C. 1702b3 and those articles, you would be able to be exempted. So Chapter 98, duties are only applicable in Chapter 98 for specified exemptions, and those are listed below. And those are basically paying the duties on the value of the repairs or paying the duties on the value of the article assembled abroad in the PRC, less the cost and value of such products in the U.S. as described. So we want to break down that goods in transit exemption. We've had a lot of questions over it. Certainly, we want people to pay the accurate duty amount. So we're going to kind of break that down today. So if you look at the exception, you're going to see that it's saying that the goods product of China and Hong Kong that were one, loaded onto a vessel at the time at the port of loading or in transit on the final mode of transport prior to entry into the U.S. before 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on February 1st, 2025, and are entered for consumption or withdrawn from the warehouse for consumption on or after 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time, February 4th, and before 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on March 7th. So the first call out I want to make is that March 7th, that is 12:01 in the morning. So I think we really want to focus on March 6th. But when we talk about what is the final mode of transport into the entry into the US, a lot of people have been confused on what that is. If we wanted to figure out how customs determines modes of transport, it's pretty easy to look at the entry summary, the customs document 7501, and see what they're looking at as modes of transport. So over on the right, we're seeing they're looking at vessel, rail, truck. And so that final mode of transport is going to determine what that date is for goods in transit. And that's how we're looking to apply the exception. The March 7th and the entered for consumption. So that's been another question. But if you wanted to look at the definition of what it does entered for consumption actually mean, we can look at the Customs Federal Register, 19 CFR 141 AF, entered for consumption. So entered for consumption means that our entry summary for consumption has been filed with customs, including the ACE transmission, and with estimated duties attached. So basically, we're looking at the time our entry is filed. So for NOADM, because they have not mentioned to date the arrival notice and the wording, we are planning to pre-clear. We're allowed to pre-clear ocean shipments 5 days in advance of arrival. So we're planning to pre-clear all goods possible by March 6th in order to take advantage of the exception. We do believe that tariff number 99030123 will be expired on March 7th. So managing multiple tariffs and understanding the 7501 and entry summary. So Customs sent out a CSMS last week, again, updating the instructions for entry summary order of reporting for multiple HTS and ACE. And they did that to add in the IEPA. So the tariffs last week were quite a challenge. The tariff numbers were available to us timely. However, there were software issues on both sides, customs as well as software vendors. So it's a bit of a challenge. We're into a situation with Hong Kong and China where we're almost tariff stacking, for lack of better words. So when we report these tariffs to U.S. Customs, we're required to report them in a certain order, and we're required to build a parent-child relationship within the system. So first, we're to report any 98 numbers if they're applicable. The second thing we will report is 99 numbers for additional duties if applicable. And then we move into the trade remedies. So first, we have to report the Section 301. Next, we have to report the IEPA. Following, we would report any Section 232 or 201 duties. Next, we report any Section 201 or 232 quotas. Next, we're looking if we have any replacement duty under 99. Then we're looking for any other quotas under 99. And finally, at number 6, we're looking at the actual commodity tariff. And so under that actual commodity tariff is where we report the entered value for the actual goods. So we want to really make sure that importers understand how to look at your 7501 and make sure you're agreeing with the duty that was submitted to U.S. Customs. I will note at this point that NOADM does have full-time auditors on staff, and we've switched to a heavy focus that every import for Hong Kong and China is currently under audit to make sure that our entry writers are keying them correctly and that the software system is working correctly and you're paying the correct duties. If you as the importer, you should always review your 7501s, and a little bit of the way to read that, we have this chart for China. Here, this importer has an exclusion for Section 301. We see the exclusion under 69, and we see that it came in as duty-free, which is correct. Next, if we're looking at number 2 over to the right for the trade remedies, we see the IEPA, and we see that we put in the in-transit exclusion. They got a duty-free. And their commodity, we had the value in for that commodity at the correct line, and then we can see their commodity is duty-free. Then if we look at line 4 of the entry summary, their article did not get the exclusion, so it took the Section 301 at 25%. Next, we see that IEEPA exclusion coming in at free. If we were filing without the exclusion, you would see 10%. And then finally, you would see the tariff number for the commodity, as well as the line value, and then the duty rate for that product. So again, it's good to understand how to look at and review the 7501s. Tariff mitigation strategies. Some of you, if you joined us before, we've been using this slide pretty much for over the last year, talking to clients about tariff avoidance or mitigation strategies. And so one of the things we want to do is ensure that entries are filed timely and accurate for accurate duties. So we're monitoring closely entry arrival dates and arrival date management, or I'm sorry, entry dates and arrival date managements, so that we ensure that the accurate duty amounts applied. For the others, we're going to cover on the next slide. The one call out we do have with duty drawback is that IEEPA tariff, the 10% for China currently in the Section 232. Those are excluded from duty drawback benefits so that you would not be able to file duty drawback. For foreign trade zones, so the common two that we're hearing over the last week, we're getting more of interest in is foreign trade zone and bonded warehouses. For foreign trade zones, privileged foreign status, duties and taxes are based on the tariff classification and appraised value determined on the application being filed, the date of the application being filed. Non-privileged status can be used to lower duties when goods are manufactured within that foreign trade zone, and they are withdrawn as products that carry a lower duty rate. Goods can be held in a foreign trade zone for an unlimited time frame. They can be manipulated, repacked, or manufactured. Goods can be exported without payment or entering into the U.S. commerce. And then, of course, there's duty deferral. Duties and taxes aren't due until the goods are withdrawn from the foreign trade zone. So bonded warehouses, it's not as easy to manufacture or manipulate the goods. However, you can use a bonded warehouse. It's a good idea if you want to hold goods up to 5 years in an effort to defer duty payment. So in other words, if you're bringing goods in and they're not sold, you could hold them in a warehouse up to 5 years until they're sold, and you collect the money to pay the duties and the taxes. So it's a good duty deferral. Goods can be exported from a bonded warehouse without entering commerce, so therefore you would not pay the customs duties if you're exporting them from the bonded warehouse. First sale is something we are looking at with clients. That's usually the lowest value is under the first sale transaction. Goods have to meet certain criteria in order to qualify. But if you can't qualify for first sale, it's absolutely a good option. Duty drawback, we talked about Section 232 and IEEPA not qualifying for drawback. Outside of that, duty allowance for goods unused, export, destroyed, or manufactured into other goods. Refunds are up to 99% of duties, taxes, and fees paid upon importation. TIBs or temporary importation bonds, we see importers often miss this, and it's a really good opportunity. If you're bringing goods into the U.S. and you just want to keep them here for a year or two, temporary importation bond is a good way to go. You're going to have to prove that you exported it or the goods have been destroyed. However, you do not have to pay duty for the period that it's in the U.S. if you're under that temporary importation bond. Resourcing. Again, we're trying to watch all the new tariffs come into play and decide where is the best country that might be a good place to resource or to ship from. So we also see importers try to avoid Section 301 duties by resourcing. Tariff engineering, that's where we take a study and we look, and Noadim can help you do this. We take a look and see if it's from a tax and duty advantage to import the completed product or simply to import the components. And then, of course, free trade agreements. Many countries do still have free to trade agreements, and this is where importers can have duty avoidance. So potential impacts and considerations, customs entries. Will customs have increases in 99 tariff codes available for entry submission? In the past, they were not. Often we didn't have the numbers the first day that it went into effect. We were doing entry amendments and post-summary corrections. This time, customs did have the tariff numbers ready for China IEEPA tariffs. However, again, there was an issue between custom system and the software systems. So brokers were really in a hard stance on the 4th and the 5th and taking software patches to upgrade the systems and get the correct duties filed. So that's always a challenge. One of the other things that we mentioned on our last Lunch and Learn, and we're going to mention it again, is a lot of times brokers are going to apply duty outlay fees if they're paying duties for you in advance. So a lot of people are going to look to start doing their own ACH payment with customs. With the new tariffs, we do expect there will be an influx of importers that will apply for the ACH, their own ACH payment to avoid those duty outlays. So we expect there will be a backlog with U.S. Customs. So if you're looking to make that change, it's good to go ahead and get that application in now so that you're not delayed. Customs bonds, imports valued over $2,500 or commodities subject to federal agency requirements require a customs bond. So customs bonds ensure payments of duties, redelivery of goods, compliance with regulations, among other things. Customs bonds, concerns with potential new tariffs. Bond saturation is a huge concern. I've seen some this week. So if there is a substantial increase in the bond sufficiency, we saw that when Section 301 tariffs were initially implemented. Bond saturation occurs when duties, taxes, and fees are more than the bond amount prior to the renewal date. So in other words, you've gone over that bond amount. Well, when we see the saturation take place and those higher bonds required by customs, we often see that the surety will have a demand for collateral or a letter of credit. We also run into bond stacking liability. So how do you mitigate your bond issues? You want to do accurate forecasting. You need to consider new tariffs and the impact on the bond amount. If you do receive an insufficiency letter from U.S. Customs, they're going to tell you the minimum amount of bond that you need to apply. However, we would encourage you to really look at your forecast and make sure that amount's going to adequately cover the duties due. If you do that, you're going to avoid bond stacking issues. So how do you determine a bond amount? So continuous bond amounts, the bond amount should be based on the estimated duties, taxes, and fees times 10% for the previous or next 12-month period, whichever amount is greater. The minimum of bond amount is still $50,000. Bonds are rounded to the nearest 10,000. If duties, taxes, and fees exceed 1 million for the 12-month period, rounding is to the nearest 100,000. So NOADM is fully equipped to help you with any bond questions that you may have. If you do get a bond saturation notice, feel free to reach out. We can help you through that process, and I'm happy to do so. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Christine, for covering so much information. It's a lot. It's a lot. And we expect much more information to be coming. So we know that you all must have many good questions, but we have unfortunately run out of time for our live Q&A. However, if you submitted a question, don't worry. Our team will follow up with you directly to make sure you get the answers you need. So that being said, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We hope you found this session informative and that it helps you stay ahead in this ever-evolving environment. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and we will be sending out the replay soon. So please keep an eye on your inbox. On behalf of NOADM, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and we look forward to supporting your logistics and trade needs. We hope you have a great day. And again, thank you guys so much for attending.